Welcome today to our performance management webinar that is being facilitated by HR Recruit and Nathan Andrew. My name is Jo Thompson. I'm a consultant for HR Recruit. I'm joined today by Nathan, who will introduce himself shortly. Nathan is going to discuss the key principles of effective performance management, including informal and formal routes, setting clear expectations, and maintaining accountability in line with best practice. If you've got any burning questions during the session, then please put them into the chat box facility and we will cover them at the end. I'm now going to hand you over to Nathan, who will introduce himself and start the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. There may be lots of you on today's webinar who have attended other webinars that I've presented alongside Jo. So if there are familiar faces, hello, it's nice to have you all join again for what is our final one of the year. As Jo said, we're going to be talking about performance management. So I've got a set of slides I'm going to run through with you. I'm hoping to work our way through the slides fairly quickly because I appreciate normally we have lots of questions at the end, which is great, and I'm happy to answer questions. So I will just run through what we're going to cover today. As Jo said, my name is Nathan. I'm the head of HR services at Fretton's Solicitors. I'm not a solicitor myself, but I am an HR practitioner. I've been practicing for over 20 years, specialising in the ER space. So all my work is focused on complex investigations, HR case management, and mediation. So I spend a lot of my time in the performance management space working alongside client organisations. One thing I say at the start of every webinar is anything we discuss today or any comments I make shouldn't be considered legal advice relating to any specific issues you may have. If you have got specific issues that you need support with, you're more than welcome to get in touch with me or anybody else that you use for HR services, etc. But I just want to be clear, this is obviously a generalised webinar to share best practice. So our session today focuses on the value of managing poor performance and how to do that effectively, and also how to address any performance concerns you have with members of your team. So hopefully this will be a really good practical webinar that will give you some hints and tips that you can take away with you and maybe share with your colleagues and management team in terms of how they can approach managing performance within their departments and across your organisation. So in terms of what we're going to be covering, we're going to be looking at identifying poor performance. We're going to be looking at the differences between performance or misconduct. We'll also cover handling complaints and performance observations. We'll also look at early intervention, obstacles to managing performance, feedback, so that's giving feedback, informal performance management, taking notes, barriers to success, help and support, and then what a formal process could look like. So that's the topics that we're going to be covering today in some detail. So a good starting point when we're talking about performance management and when you're looking at issues around someone maybe not meeting the expectations that you have of them in their job role, what we need to do is be able to identify what is poor performance. Now, one thing I always say to clients is that we need to be clear on what good looks like. So when we say there's a performance issue, we should be able to articulate clearly with the individuals concerned or with your team on a more general basis around what good looks like for your organisation and specifically for that team, because every team will have a different role or different responsibilities, and so you need to be really clear on the standards that you're wanting to uphold, and you want to be able to articulate that clearly to your employees around what your expectations are, so there's no confusion, there's no ambiguity. In terms of identifying poor performance, there are a number of tools that you can use and should be using to draw on when you're looking at whether someone is meeting the expectations you have of them in their job role. So that can include appraisals, one-to-one meetings, the notes, the output of those meetings. It could be finished work and reports that are being produced. It could be financial and sales reports. And clearly it can also be objectives and KPIs that are being set. Alongside feedback and observations that you're giving or providing employees, which should be on a regular, ongoing basis. The one thing I always say is if you are dealing with concerns around performance and you have an employee who is pregnant, I always recommend take specific advice because we need to be cautious in terms of how we manage that situation. So that's a caveat that I would put in there. But those key tools that I've referenced there, those are the things that I would expect you to be drawing on when you are looking to address any performance concerns with a member of your team. So one of the questions that I often get asked is particularly around managing performance is, when should I be managing performance? And my comment always is that performance management should be an ongoing process. It shouldn't be a process that we only use when there are issues. It should be a process whereby we're giving regular feedback to employees, we're telling them when they're doing well, we're picking up issues early on if they're not quite meeting the standards or the expectations of the organisation. It should be on an ongoing, regular basis. So there should never be a time where we don't give any feedback and we only give feedback when there's an issue. So in terms of managing poor performance, I always advise have regular discussions and give feedback. Early intervention is always best. So addressing issues early on when they're small and not allowing them to fester or to snowball and become bigger issues is always preferable. And I think it sets you up for success in managing performance issues. You should always look to celebrate successes. So again, acknowledging when someone's doing something well and they're meeting those standards, that's really key, because what you're doing is you're saying to them, actually, you're doing what I need you to do. It also gives you an opportunity to have conversations if there are areas that could be improved upon. Again, picking up on issues early on is really helpful. I always say with performance management, there should be no surprises. So if, for example, you have gone through an informal process of giving feedback, trying to support someone to improve if there are issues. What shouldn't be the case is that if you have to deal with things more formally, that individual shouldn't be surprised, because they should be aware that through your informal conversations on a regular, ongoing basis, that there are concerns or there are areas to be improved upon. Often what I see in my work is when people start to manage performance, it can sometimes feel to the employee concerned that this has all come out of the blue, because there isn't that regular dialogue and there isn't that regular feedback, which also means that when we do attempt to manage performance, it can feel really contentious really quickly. The individual concerned can become really defensive because they're unclear on our motives. And that means that actually that whole process can feel really combative early on. So for me, good, robust feedback on an ongoing basis, whether that's acknowledging when things are going well and also picking up on issues when they're small and not significant, that's really important, because it just put people on notice that particularly if there are concerns, that you are wanting to have a conversation about where they can improve. And you can also set out the support mechanisms that you can put in place to help facilitate that. It's also really important to be clear through your communication that you create a shared understanding of the requirements of someone's performance in their job role. So that shouldn't be a secret. It shouldn't come as a surprise to somebody. If you're having regular feedback, open dialogue, open communication, you should hopefully build in the shared understanding around what is expected and what is required. So again, that feeds back into the no surprises piece. For me, a good performance management process should look like there being no surprises. Everyone should be on the same page. Something we always discuss when we're managing performance, and certainly when we're talking about performance with clients, is knowing the difference between performance or misconduct. And sometimes it can feel like it's difficult to tell if you're dealing with a performance issue or if you're dealing with a conduct issue. And the key question we will always ask the client is the employee's actions deliberate in their view? So for me, if somebody is capable of doing what is expected, and that's been evidenced before, and that they're choosing not to do what's required of them, for me, that's a conduct issue. The difference between performance or capability potentially is where somebody, no matter how much training or support you're giving them, they're not able to meet the standards that you're expecting of them. And that becomes performance, potentially capability. So that's a really good differentiator. So I always say, if you're dealing with concerns about performance, just pause and ask the question, do I think the employee's actions are deliberate in terms of what I'm trying to address with them? And that can be really helpful. So deliberate for me always equals misconduct, and it needs to be addressed properly and robustly, always. So, handling complaints and performance observations. Depending on your sector, depending on the type of organisation, we have clients who are working in the hospitality sector, for example, the retail sector. You can receive customer complaints, and that can put your notice that maybe there is an issue with someone's performance. Sometimes it can be conduct if you're dealing with a customer complaint, but we're focusing on performance for today's webinar. And so the reason I cover this is because I always want to be clear that a complaint might be raised by a customer or colleague, and how we approach dealing with that is really important. So we always advise, if you're dealing with complaints specifically, always be discreet, step back and look at the complaint and ask yourself the question, is it genuine? Particularly if it's coming from a customer. Giving the employee a chance to respond is really important. So if you do receive a customer complaint or a grievance raised by a colleague, it's really important that we don't make assumptions. We step back. We adopt a fact-finding approach, and that should include giving the employee in question a chance to respond to any issues or concerns that are being raised. You also need to ask yourself the question, do you need to investigate? Sometimes you don't. Sometimes it might be a straightforward matter that actually you don't need to conduct a full investigation. Other times it's necessary. And so you need to step back and ask yourself the question, is this a significant issue? Do I need to investigate to gather more facts to establish essentially what may or may not have taken place? So that is particularly important. And I always say when you're handling complaints, be it customer or colleague, adopt that approach always, because it means that hopefully you will adopt a sensible approach in terms of how you deal with that situation. So why should you deal with performance issues early on? Well, for us, we always advise when we're working with clients is that if you're not dealing with issues early on, it can sometimes become harder to to raise issues and then resolve them fairly. And ideally, you'd like to try and resolve issues informally if you can. So the sooner you can pick up issues and the sooner you can have conversations with an employee, the easier it is to address those concerns because they've not become significant issues. They're minor issues that you're picking up almost on an as and when basis. So as things come up, you deal with it, you nip it in the bud, and hopefully you can move forward. The other issue with not dealing with issues or performance concerns early on is that it does create a greater risk of a dispute arising because memories do fade. With time, people do forget what may or may not have taken place. And so it's particularly important that you are dealing with issues early on and you are capturing records of any discussions you're having to avoid that issue. Often we see in our work where a line manager may be wanting to address or challenge performance concerns. It's not been dealt with, quickly enough. So things have become more entrenched in terms of patterns of behaviour, for example. And then when you're trying to address that, often because recollections fade with time, memories fade, then the employee can often, view the line manager's approach to address those concerns as almost a dispute issue, and they then become suspicious around the intentions of those conversations. So our advice always is address those concerns early on, have an upfront, open conversation, make sure you take good records of those discussions to avoid things escalating or becoming contentious. Again, another aspect we always talk about is the negative impact on performance of the team and the organisation as a whole if performance concerns aren't being addressed proactively and robustly. So again, it all speaks to be proactive. If there are concerns, deal with them early on so that you can nip things in the bud, put things to bed and move forward. Another key issue that I often see, and this goes back to, where disputes can arise, is that if things aren't dealt with on a regular basis and things come to, if you have a conversation out of the blue with an employee, they can often feel suspicious and they believe that there are ulterior motives by that conversation taking place. And so again, what you want to do is build in to your kind of communication style with your team that giving and receiving feedback is normal. It's not to be feared. It is an opportunity to table issues, find resolution and move forward. What you don't want to do is ignore issues, have conversations out of the blue where the employee may perceive that as an attempt or the start of a process whereby the organisation wants to remove them from their role, which is often not the case, but often I see these issues arise when I'm working with clients. The other issues to think about as well by not dealing with performance concerns early on is it does have a negative impact on colleagues' motivation. Colleagues in particular can become very frustrated if they feel that they are carrying the load in terms of work for the team and they've got other colleagues within their team who maybe aren't performing or contributing to the same standard. And so if they feel that you're overlooking that, particularly if you're a line manager, that can cause demotivation and it can also result in people becoming frustrated with their colleagues, and that can then impact on working relationships. So again, all of these issues that I've tabled, it does speak to be proactive, as I said, deal with issues early on so that you can move forward and hopefully avoid any kind of formal issues needing to be addressed later on. So some of the things that get in the way of managing performance is if you are a line manager in particular, and I see this a lot with clients that I work with, is that when you are managing performance, you do have to open yourself up potentially to feedback, and that can feel like you're being criticised as a line manager. And actually, what I always recommend with my clients is, look, if there are concerns that you have as a line manager about someone's performance in their role, you have the right to manage and you have the right to have a conversation, but we also need to be able to step back and be reflective. So if, for example, when we're discussing issues or concerns with an employee, we also need to be able to receive feedback. So if there's something that we're doing that the employee finds frustrating or the employee believes gets in the way of how they perform in their role, we need to be open to that feedback, and we need to capture the feedback, and we need to do something with that information. So again, that is an obstacle that I often see in my work that gets in the way of good performance management. I also deal with situations where you have line managers who want to be friends with their team, and there's nothing wrong with being friendly with your colleagues or the team that you're managing. But you also need to remember that if you are in that line management role, you are the team leader, and you are responsible for managing your people, and that includes having to have conversations around performance. So again, the relationships line managers build with their team can present as obstacles that need to be managed and need to be overcome, and often that's where HR can step in with a coaching and mentoring approach to help address some of those issues. The other downside that often line managers will share with me when we talk about performance management is the time involved. If you're dealing with things early on and you're dealing with it at the informal stage, hopefully you're going to nip things in the bud, and that will be sufficient to see an improvement in performance. The challenge comes when things have been left and they've escalated and patterns of behaviour or poor performance become more entrenched, and then it takes more time to manage that situation. There is a process you have to follow, starting with the informal stage and potentially going through to a more formal stage if at the informal stage you're not seeing the desired improvement that you require from an individual. So again, it's an obstacle. It takes time, it takes perseverance, and it does take patience. The other challenge we often get in the work that I do, certainly when I'm supporting in-house HR teams, is that line managers often think it's not their role and it's up to HR to manage performance concerns. Now, for all the HR practitioners who are on the webinar today, our role is absolutely to business partner, to support, to coach line managers, and to help find solutions to some of their challenges. But the reality of the situation is the line manager is the line manager. It's their responsibility to manage their team. Our role is to advise, to guide, to act as a sounding board, and as I say, to really business partner in a strategic way that helps that line manager get the very best out of their team. But ultimately, it is for the line manager to go about the business of managing their team. It's not for us to pick that up for them. In fact, if we do, we're doing them a disservice, because what we're not doing is allowing them to develop the skills that they need to become an effective leader within their organisation. So in terms of giving feedback, these are some tips that I'm going to share with you. Obviously, I'm going to make the slides available to Joe, so you can take these away with you. But we always advise our clients that feedback should always be prompt. It should be objective and constructive always. It should be clear, so the employee needs to understand the issue. I always say clear is kind, unclear is unkind. So while sometimes having an open conversation and setting the record straight in terms of what our concerns are may feel uncomfortable, but in you being clear, you're actually being kind to that employee, and you're actually helping them and supporting them in improving and meeting your expectations as their line manager. I always recommend that feedback should be face to face wherever possible. I know we live in an era now where we know lots of things take place via Microsoft Teams, and sometimes that's unavoidable, and that can be the next best thing to a face to face meeting. But my preference always is, wherever possible, bring somebody into a meeting room, sit down, have a conversation. You're able to look at body language, you're able to read the room better because you're present with the individual concerned, and it feels much more personal. So I always advise face to face wherever possible. Be consistent in terms of how you give feedback. So don't give feedback sporadically. Build that into part of your weekly touch points or conversations with your team, so that it becomes the norm. So you're building a culture of feedback that is, where feedback becomes normal, that no one has any concerns around you sitting down having a conversation. I think that's particularly important. It should also be unemotional and professional, which sounds very obvious, but when you're caught up, it's particularly if you're a line manager, when you're caught up managing performance concerns, emotions can run high sometimes. And again, that will lessen with time if you are consistent with giving feedback. We also say that feedback must give specific information, so you shouldn't include general comments. Be really specific about what the issues are, so that when you conclude a conversation, both parties are clear on what the issues are and what the goals are in terms of improving in areas of concern. Explanation of impact on colleagues and organisation, again, really important. So if an employee's performance is impacting their work colleagues, be clear with them on that so they understand. That's really helpful. And also be really clear on the details around what improvement looks like. So that's what good looks like again. So we're having a conversation with somebody and we're saying to them, you're not meeting the standards we would expect in your role. Let's be really clear on what improvements are required for them to raise that standard to an acceptable level where you are then satisfied that they're performing in the way that you need them to do in their role. Again, encouragement is key along with support and advice. All sounds obvious, but these are good takeaways, and these are certainly tips that we will share with clients when we're working through a performance management process. So some obvious ones around what not to do when handling performance concerns. Never get angry, don't show your frustration. It can be very easy to do so, particularly when you are the line manager, but always avoid getting angry. If you feel that emotions are running high, I would suggest that you step back and look at maybe changing the day that you're planning to have a conversation so that when you do have that conversation, you're in the right frame of mind to be able to invest your time in that process. Don't do or say anything that embarrasses the employee in front of work colleagues. Don't be judgmental and never threaten to dismiss. That will just get in the way of a really good performance management process, particularly at the informal stage. Ideally, when we're working at the informal stage, what we want to do is to drive an improvement in performance. If we start to threaten dismissal, that's going to get in the way of any conversations that we have with the employee concerned. Again, slightly repetitive, and we've touched on this already, but I can't emphasize enough, consistency is absolutely key. We always advise you adopt a reasonable and fair approach to how you manage performance. You shouldn't single out employees. You absolutely need to get to know your team and need to know their capability and how they perform in their role. And you need to identify particularly when you're dealing with performance issues, is it an individual or a team issue? Sometimes I deal with matters where actually it becomes more apparent that it's a team issue rather than one individual, and therefore you need to adapt to the approach you take. So what to do when feedback doesn't work? And we sometimes do see this. I always say good performance management should look like we nip things in the bud early on. So that's at the informal stage. We're having informal conversations, and hopefully that will be sufficient to drive an improvement in performance. Sometimes feedback doesn't always work, and I see that a lot, and that can be really frustrating for a line manager. And what we always advise when feedback isn't working is that they should meet with the employee, hold a meeting in private. They should follow an improvement period that's appropriate to the circumstances. So look at the issues you're dealing with, and then make a judgment around what improvement period is actually realistic to allow this employee the opportunity to meet my expectations and the standards we expect of them. You should express concerns, be specific and constructive. So again, specific feedback is really important. You should review how the employee has responded to the process. So, for example, if they've responded negatively, that might be a conversation piece. I'd want to sit down with them and say, look, I'm really concerned. I want to have these conversations with you. I'm aware that you're appearing to take the feedback negatively, and that's your opportunity to then, reinforce the message. We want you to improve. We want to improve the situation, and therefore, us giving you feedback is about supporting you in meeting the standards we expect. I say this all the time, record keeping is really, really important. Make sure when you're having conversations, even at the informal stage, take notes and follow things up in writing. One of the things that I used to do when I was, back in my corporate life, when I was managing a team, is when I was giving feedback, and I used to make that a regular part of my week when I was working with my team, I would make sure that when I gave feedback, and particularly if there were any concerns, following any conversation or meeting, I would email that individual with a very, a summary bulleted list of things we discussed and any agreed actions or outcomes. So I would literally go back and say, dear Jane Doe, following our conversation today, we discussed this and we've agreed this. You can tailor that email to your style of communication. If you're working through things at an informal stage, keep it informal. But what I would then do is copy an HR and make sure that a copy of that email is placed on their personnel file. Because if later on you're not seeing an improvement in their performance, despite the feedback you're giving them, you can then rely on your notes as evidence later on that you've had informal conversations and you have actively worked with them to improve the situation. So keeping good contemporaneous records is really key to a good performance management process. If we look at positive employee response, allow the employee time to improve. Praise and support and encourage always. So when you're seeing them working hard, they're actively working to meet your expectations in terms of the standards of performance. Acknowledge that and praise that, because that can actually encourage further improvement, and it can also motivate. Always arrange a further review meeting, so don't just have one meeting and let things slide. Step back, look at your diary and think, when can I next meet with this employee so we can have a review? That's really important. If you're dealing with a negative employee response, some of the things we would always say that you need to consider are, does the employer understand the issues and the seriousness of what you're addressing? If it's at the informal stage, it might be that you are doing things very early on, and actually we don't need to be too heavy-handed. But if you've had, 2 or 3 informal meetings, including, review meetings, where you've given feedback, you've given them a sufficient period of time to try and meet those standards that you're expecting of them, what we then need to start talking about the potential ramifications for if an improvement in performance is not achieved. And that might look like going through a formal performance management process where we introduce, a performance improvement plan. We work through that process on a more formal basis, and it could also result in sanctions. So I think, you need to pick the right time to have that conversation. But ultimately, if you think that we're going to have to deal with things more formally, it's always helpful to put the employee on notice of that. So again, there are no surprises. As I've really touched on, sometimes giving feedback doesn't work, it doesn't have the desired effect, and you need to then make a decision about whether you move to a formal performance management process. If you're a line manager and you're thinking of doing that and you have HR resource in-house, speak to your HR manager, get them on board, get them working with you because they will support you through that process. Keeping things informal early on, so we've touched on this already, but I'm a big fan of nipping things in the bud, as I've said, keeping things informal so we don't have to go through a full formal process. So I always say explain improvements that are required and any timescales you're imposing. Schedule private meetings, allowing sufficient time for those meetings to take place. Remember, those meetings are a two-way process. So it's not just about us giving feedback, but it's also about allowing the employee to table any concerns that they have and also for them to give us feedback. Always review what's been agreed, give examples of good or poor performance and be really clear on those examples. Set out supervision and support, consider any external factors, and follow that process at the informal stage tightly and be consistent in your approach. So it's not just, don't just do this with one employee. I would always advise that you treat all employees the same. If you've got concerns around performance, nip things in the bud and follow this process. We've already talked about taking notes, but I always say your notes are evidence. So make sure they accurately reflect the meeting, set out agreed action points, make sure you type them up quickly. Often I can see, meetings maybe would have happened a week ago, and then a line manager's actually, I've not typed up my notes. And sometimes they can forget things that were discussed. So it's really important those notes are typed up quickly and always send action points to the employee. And that goes back to my approach, which is if I have a meeting with an employee, I just send them an informal email setting out the key discussion points and setting out any action points so we're all clear. I always say don't doodle, and I've been in meetings with line managers where they're kind of doodling and not actually taking, very comprehensive notes. Never make personal comments or jokes during those meetings, even though that you might be having an informal meeting. You may later want to rely on the content of those meetings, and what you don't want to do is leave yourself open to complaints that you behaved inappropriately during the course of that process. Never write anything that would embarrass an employee, and I always say a good rule of thumb for a line manager or an HR practitioner is never write anything down that you would be concerned about being read out in an employment tribunal. So that's particularly important. Help and support, we talk about this a lot, but obviously if you are dealing with performance concerns, particularly early on, the intention should be that we want to help and support the individual to succeed. Sometimes that doesn't always happen despite our best efforts, but the intention should always be we help someone to succeed and meet our expectations of them in their job role. That could look like, providing additional training, coaching, could be support from HR. That could include things like an occupational health referral if there are health concerns, for example, that might be impacting performance. Allowing additional time. It could be looking at alternative or improved resources, so checklists, for example, or how-to guides that might support them in their job role. And it could also be looking at things like flexible working, whether that's temporary or permanent, that might help facilitate an improvement in performance. So these are things that you could look at considering. So what comes after an informal process is potentially a formal process. And if you have given feedback, you've kept good records at the informal stage, and you still see no improvement in the performance, then you have to make a decision around, does this need to become a more formal process? And so some of the key points I've set out here for you to take away with you is you would want to implement a formal process if the informal stage doesn't work and you're not seeing any improvement. A formal process shouldn't be a surprise. We've already talked about that. Through the informal stage, you should have been, having good open communication whereby the employee is very clear that there are concerns, and particularly if there's no improvement, they're clear that my line manager is becoming concerned that I'm not actually meeting the standards they're expecting of me despite the feedback and the support that I'm being given. You always want to set measurable objectives and targets, so you don't want to set somebody up to fail, particularly when you're going through a formal process. We need to be even more robust with setting targets and objectives for improvement. You want to be more robust in terms of holding regular review meetings, in addition to ongoing feedback. You also want to consider potentially increased supervision that might be necessary. Again, you need to take into consideration the context of the matter that you're dealing with. Set timescales depending on the circumstances. So be really realistic. I've worked with clients before where their timescales are quite short and it's not really allowing sufficient time for someone to work through the improvement process. So again, take into consideration the circumstances of what you are dealing with. We need to put people on notice that warnings and dismissals could be likely if performance doesn't improve. So particularly when you're going to the formal stage, the employee should know that if we work through the formal process and we don't see an improvement, what the outcomes could be. So again, there's no surprises, and we should do that early on. Again, redeployment could be a possibility, but I would never advise that you promise to move somebody into a new role. And I would always advise a line manager, speak to your in-house HR team or your HR advisor. If you don't have an in-house team, but you have an independent consultant, get in touch with them and get some proper advice. But I certainly would never recommend you just guarantee or promise to redeploy somebody into a new role, because ideally we need to understand what's causing the poor performance, and you want to avoid moving a performance issue into another team or into another role. As I've already said, work with HR closely. They're there to advise you, and managing a formal performance process. It's complicated, and there could be a number of factors you need to take into consideration. So getting regular, robust advice is essential. And I just want to briefly touch on the settlement agreement. So this comes up a lot when we're managing performance. So settlement agreements could be a useful tool if you're dealing with performance concerns, particularly at the formal stage. But I always say to clients, don't just assume that you can pay somebody off and shortcut the process. It's not a substitute for managing poor performance. Settlement agreements do have their place, and I'm not going to go into any real detail today because that goes beyond the scope of this webinar, but they can be a useful tool, but not a substitute for a good performance management process. Again, raising settlement during a performance discussion could undermine the integrity of the process. So we need to be clear that if you're having conversations on a without prejudice basis, to be able to do that and to have those discussions protected, you would need to have a dispute with the employee in place that you're trying to resolve. And one way of doing that might be that you enter into discussions with an employee on a without prejudice basis, looking to agree a parting ways on agreed terms under a settlement agreement. Now, if you're in a formal process, that is likely to give rise to a dispute where you could argue that actually it's appropriate to have a conversation on a without prejudice basis. However, if you're dealing with things very early on an informal basis, and I've actually got a case at the moment where there are performance concerns that a client has with an employee, no feedback's been given, the employee is completely unaware of these performance concerns, and the client wants to have a conversation. Essentially said we want to have a settlement discussion with the individual concerned. What we've said to that client is actually, look, at this stage there doesn't appear to be anything that would amount to a dispute with the employee, and therefore we've had to talk about the difference between a without prejudice conversation and a protected conversation. A protected conversation is a conversation that you can have with an employee that allows you to have confidential discussions whereby there is no dispute in place between the employer and the employee. So that could be a mechanism that you could use. However, a point I always draw people's attention to is that protected conversation only offers protection to unfair dismissal claims, so ordinary unfair dismissal claims. It doesn't apply to things like whistleblowing or discrimination claims. So if you're going to have a protected conversation, you want to make sure that there are no exceptional circumstances relating to that individual that could give rise to a whistleblowing claim or a discrimination claim that they could try and bring against your organisation. So that's something to absolutely consider. I always say never have confidential settlement discussions unless you've spoken to HR or your legal advisors, because you want to make sure that if you are going to do that, that whatever you're doing is going to be protected and not disclosable in the event that someone wants to bring a claim against your organisation. If an employee raises the possibility of settlement, it's really important that you separate out those discussions. You don't have those discussions as part of an open process. And what I mean by an open process is any HR process you're following. So performance management, for example, that would take place on an open basis. That can't happen on a without prejudice basis. So if an employee says, actually, I want to look at agreeing a parting ways on agreed terms, we need to have a separate conversation and make sure that that conversation is protected, as I've said, so always take advice. So key takeaways, so things to remember, performance management is an ongoing process. It's 24/7. It shouldn't just be a process that you follow when there's an issue. So you should be managing performance, good, bad, consistently all of the time. It's part of our role as a line manager, as leaders. We should always act promptly, take responsibility where relevant, be consistent and fair, give objective, structured feedback. We've already talked about this, but this is really important. And to be able to give good, structured feedback, you need to plan and you need to prepare. So in advance of having conversations, make sure you're clear on what you want to talk about. Be discreet and sensitive. Show empathy. That goes a long way. I think that's really important. Keep good records. Keep notes. And always try and reach a shared understanding of what is required in terms of improvement. That's really important. Set clear performance expectations. Always, wherever possible, try to resolve issues informally. That goes a long way to demonstrate your reasonableness as an employer. Speak to HR if you're in doubt about any formal process. Set clear and realistic targets. Adopt a problem-solving approach, and the aim should always be to improve performance. We shouldn't be looking to set anybody up to fail. And there ends the webinar. You'll see at the end on my slides, this details the employment team that I work with, and also myself and my colleague Fran, who are the HR services team. And I'll hand back to Joe.
There's only one question so far, Nathan.
Oh, okay.
So if anyone's got any questions, pop them into the chat box facility. So Jeanette's asked, what are your thoughts of placing employees on a blacklist, and how can employees be taken off a blacklist effectively?
What do you mean by blacklist? If you can pop that in the comments, just so I know.
It must be something internally, possibly.
Yeah.
Hopefully Jeanette's still on and she can pop that in. There's another question come up. Do you want to answer that one in the meantime, Nathan?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So Linda's asked, when having a formal PIT process, what would be a relevant time frame for each review meeting?
Really depends on the circumstances. The context is going to be really key. It might be that actually it's relevant to have an improvement period that spans maybe 4 to 6 weeks. So if you're dealing with something that's fairly routine, that could be realistic. If you're dealing with something that's fairly complicated, it might be that you want to extend that. But obviously you don't want to go, it's not an open-ended process. We need to be, time bound in our approach, because ultimately it's not good for business if someone's not employing and it's having an impact, say, on customers and colleagues. And it's also not good for the employee if they know they're subject to a formal process. So again, context is always key. For me, if I'm dealing with a routine performance improvement process, I often work with a 4 to 6 week timescale. Sometimes that can go, anywhere between 3 to 6 months. If you've got somebody who's got full employment rights, we always say the performance management process is not always a straightforward process, and it does take time. But again, yeah, I sound like a politician when I say it. Context is always key. You need to take into consideration the circumstances. And again, if you're struggling with that, just think about to yourself, what would be reasonable for you, and maybe sense check that with a colleague, or in particular HR. HR is always a good go-to.
Okay, Claire's asked, any advice performance managing team members that work between day and night shifts that you wouldn't normally see day to day?
Yeah, I mean that's really difficult. I've worked in organisations where we've had night shifts, and I've had to go back many a time at night to meet with individuals for performance improvement processes and so on. I mean, what I would say is, when you have teams who work in different shift patterns, for example, you are going to need to rely on your line managers, and that means you have to be really focused on developing line manager capability in terms of how they manage performance within their team. Um, but it's not easy to manage, and I think you have to be really proactive in managing that situation. And it might mean that if you are the HR practitioner, you do have to go in of an evening and support the line manager in having conversations. I've had to do it many times over the years, and that's just part of the job if you're working in that type of environment where there is, a 24/7 shift pattern. I hope that answers the question.
Abby's asked an interesting one, Nathan. So, how would you advise floor-based managers, for example, restaurant manager or a head chef, manage recording informal performance chats and holding formal chats when their teams are needed on the floor through their working hours?
I think if you need to have a conversation with somebody and they're not me, it's particularly around performance, you have to take them off the shop, essentially the shop floor. I refer to it as the shop floor. So I think back to my Sainsbury's days, for example, if I had concerns about a team member and they were sat on a checkout, we would pull them off the till, we'd have to cover that, and we would go and have the conversation. Yes, it's challenging. Yes, it gets in the way potentially of the operations of the organisation, but it's never appropriate to have a conversation in an open space where it could be overheard, and that could leave you exposed to complaints. And so you have to manage that situation, and that does mean juggling resource sometimes. But my advice always is never do it, on a shop floor in an open work area. You should take somebody to one side in a private setting where you both can sit down, make time to have a decent conversation about what the issues are, and set the expectations around and targets and objectives for improvement.
There's no other questions, Nathan.
Well, that's very straightforward.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let me just yeah, there's nothing else come up there. Right, so I'll send out some correspondence to everyone that's signed up for the event this afternoon, and I'll put a post on LinkedIn. So if you'd like a copy of the follow-up information or recording, then please put a comment on the LinkedIn post. Our next event is actually next year, Tuesday the 20th of January, and it's called How Does Motivation Unlock Success? A link to sign up for that will be included in the email. If anyone is recruiting, we've also got FD recruit, accountancy recruit, exec recruit, and charity recruit within the group. But otherwise, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to Nathan for your time and effort in putting the event together, and to everyone for signing in. Thanks very much.